Shema, this is the one-liner coming out of the book of Deuteronomy. Literally, Shema means listen, hey. And actually, there are other verses in Deuteronomy that start the same way. Shema Yisrael, except sometimes it's a different saying. It's, hear, O Israel, the laws and the rules that I've commanded you. It's not, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, or Adonai, your God, Adonai is one. And there's even been experiments at writing new versions of a Shema that maybe are more relevant to Jews today. Some humanistic Jewish communities have written a new version of a Shema. Shema Yisrael, Echad Amenu, Adam Echad. Hear, O Israel, our people is one, humanity is one. Still begins with Shema Yisrael, still ends with Echad. You can sing it to the traditional melody if you want. Of course, the challenge is for some people, the original version is so canonical, so important that you can't really change it. It's like if I were to sing, I bless America, it would feel clunky. So for some people, changing a Shema makes sense. For others, it's the watchword of our faith. Even if we don't believe it, it's still, the original version. The next word is Kaddish. And you'll notice a few words down, I have the word Kiddush. So can someone explain the difference between Kaddish and Kiddush?
Well, Kiddush is the blessing, so blessing over the wine. And
okay.
Kaddish, what you say in honor of your deceased family.
Susie?
And the interesting thing about Kaddish, which is often thought of as the mourner's prayer, it's really a glorification of God. It's a celebration and praise, exaltation of God. It does not talk about the people who died.
And did you know that there are multiple versions of the Kaddish? There's the mourner's Kaddish, which is recited at funerals. But if you attended a conservative or an Orthodox prayer service, you would hear the Kaddish multiple times. There's a half Kaddish, a full Kaddish, the scholar's Kaddish. The Kaddish is like the signal it's time to go on to the next section. So when you're done with the standing prayer, you end with a Kaddish. And when you're done with the Torah service, you end with a Kaddish. And it's a rote praise of God that starts the same way, Yitkadal v'Yitkadash, may the great name be praised. You're right, it doesn't talk about God, but it's also not unique to mourning. Most people think of the Kaddish as the mourner's prayer, but actually, these other versions of Kaddish are also part of a traditional service. Not only the mourner's Kaddish that's assigned for people who have lost someone. But what's similar between the Kiddush as the blessing of the wine and the Kaddish as the praise of God is that three-letter root. Remember?
Right.
K, D, sh. And that root, K, D, sh, means holy, sanctified. So there's a famous part in the prayer service where you say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And you actually rise up on your toes when you say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. It's again that word holy. So the Kaddish is a praise of God because God is holy. The Kiddush is a praise of God because God is holy, but it's sanctifying the drinking of wine. So it's not just drinking wine, it's sanctifying it in a special way. Okay? So Kaddish, Kiddush, same root, makes sense. Now, Siddur, you may or may not know, you've probably heard the word Seder with Passover. So if Seder for Passover means order, the order you have the meal, what would you guess Siddur might be? Now that you've got your three-letter root ears listening.
The order of the prayer service.
Right. So a Siddur is a word for a prayer book. But it's a prayer book in a certain order. Yeah.
Kaddishes in the conservative synagogue. So the Kaddish are all over the place in the Siddur.
Yes, the Kaddish is in the Siddur. Exactly. And you put down your Siddur before you go out for the Kiddush, or the wine blessing and the nibbles after the service. So Siddur is a prayer book, but it's a prayer book set in a certain order. And the first Siddur was put together probably around the year 800 or 900 of the Common Era. And there was an order before that. It just hadn't been collected into one book. And the idea of a Siddur is a later innovation. Synagogue or shul is sometimes used in Yiddish. Jewish house of worship, right? The root is a place of meeting. You can think of the word synod from Greek as a meeting, a gathering. So synagogue is the same root. In Hebrew, the term is Beit Knesset, which means Beit is house of. Beit Knesset is a house of gathering, a house of meeting. It's not a house of God. The Beit El, the house of God, that was the temple in Jerusalem. The Beit Midrash, that was the house of study. Hear that word Midrash? The Beit Midrash was the house of study. But the Beit Knesset was the house of gathering and meeting. You would come together to hear readings from the Torah, to say prayer services that required a certain minimum number of men to recite. It was the place of meeting. So it didn't necessarily have to be focused on God. Okay, we talked about Kiddush. Kippah. What's a kippah?
Yarmulke.
Okay, what's a yarmulke? Define the
skull
word with
cap.
another fancy word. Skull
skull
cap.
cap.
Okay, that's another one. It's a beanie, right? Without the propeller. It's a head covering that's, again, as I mentioned, one of those minhag. It's a custom, but a custom that's become almost universal. Traditionally, only men wore kippot. Women had to wear a different kind of head covering. But nowadays, in many liberal Jewish circles, women have chosen to wear a kippot as well. And some people choose not to wear a kippah. My line is that everyone's in charge of their own head. If they want to wear one, that's fine. If they don't want to wear one, that's fine. Some people wear it sometimes. I had friends that wouldn't wear a kippah all day long, but when they went to Jewish studies classes where they were studying the Bible, they put a kippah on in class because they felt like it was that kind of a moment where they wanted to mark it as something different. Okay, the next one is talis.
Prayer shawl.
Talis is the prayer shawl, often black and white or blue and white. It's has a lot of fringes at the end. The tradition is that you're supposed to, this is a commandment from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah itself, that says you're supposed to wear a four-cornered garment that has fringes on it. And so some people wear what's called a talit katan, a small talit, that's the mini prayer shawl, sort of around your waist that sort of hangs out. And then the full talis you would wear at the prayer service. Notice, by the way, in Hebrew it's talit, but in Yiddish pronunciation, you'd say talis. The hard T at the end often becomes an S in the Yiddish or Ashkenazi pronunciation. So, for example, Shabbat, hard T, becomes Shabbos. Or Sukkot, another holiday in the fall, becomes Sukkos. And a talit becomes a talis. That's just the Yiddish accent affecting the Hebrew. Okay, chavurah. Who's heard of a chavurah?
Which one's the Yiddish?
The Yiddish is with the S at the end. Think Shabbos, Sukkot, Sukkos. Right. You say in Yiddish, you say good Shabbos. You hear the good, right? That's not Hebrew. So good Shabbos is Yiddish. Shabbat Shalom with a hard T at the end would be the Hebrew way of saying that. So a talit would be the Hebrew, and a talis would be the Yiddish or Ashkenazi style Hebrew pronunciation. And that's the weird part because technically the plural of a talit is talitot in Hebrew. But a lot of people will say talesim because they take the talis from the Yiddish pronunciation and put the generic im ending, but because it's a female noun, it should be talitot, but they don't say talisos, they say talesim, and it's a mishmash of grammar from Hebrew and Yiddish and the usage and so on. So that kind of quirky translation happens all the time. Okay, the next word down is chavurah. Chavurah is related to the word chaver. Chaver is a friend or a companion or comrade. Actually, if you were a Jewish communist, you would have called each other chaver. Chavurah is a small kind of intentional Jewish community. And this really took off in the 1970s and 80s. There was a whole Chavurah movement where people said they didn't want to be part of these big soulless synagogues. They wanted a more intentional, lay-led community where people were educated, but they could do it for themselves. So there's a whole movement called the Chavurah Institute that started around this time. And even within larger congregations, they would start these small chavurot, that's the plural of Chavurah, where people would have discussion groups, mutual support. fellowship circles, that kind of thing, as a way to create that more intimate community. So chavurah is a style of Jewish community, particularly popular in the last 50 years or so, that comes from that root chaver, or friend. Next one is mikvah. I don't mean the former Judge Abner mikvah.
Ritual bath.
Right. For what purpose?
It's purifying, right? And
Or you have sex after you've had your period.
Well, you don't have the sex in the mikvah. You
Right,
have to-
right. No, but after you've had your period to purify you because you're supposedly unclean. Even though
supposedly,
you're cleaner than ever.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So the idea was that if you had touched a dead body, or if a man had had a nocturnal emission of semen, or a woman had had her menstrual period, they became unclean for a certain period of time. And if you need to be purified, you go to a ritual bath, a mikvah. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bath. You could use an open body of water. So people would go to the ocean. You can use an ocean for a mikvah. You could use a river for a mikvah. The tricky part is you're supposed to be buck naked in the mikvah. There should be nothing between you and the water. So you might not be as comfortable doing that in the ocean or in a lake or in a public river. Not a lake because it's a closed body water, but an open body like a river or an ocean you could do. And for some people, the mikvah is a very meaningful ritual of a kind of purification and release. For others, it can be a very offensive experience because you get examined by a mikvah attendant before you get in the water, and who's watching you, and it's really you hear stories of people leaving ultra-Orthodox communities, and one of their complaints is what their experience was in the mikvah. And even the fact that it's used with this regime of enforcing ritual purity and impurity can be very alienating. You know, if you're in the middle of your period as a woman, your husband won't touch you because then he might become impure. And that could be really alienating to have 1 or 2 weeks a month where you're simply not touching each other. Some people are very touch oriented, and that can be very problematic. So if modern liberal Jews choose to follow some kind of mikvah purification ritual, they tend to be more flexible on the purity impurity side of things.
When you define that, when you become impure, you said if you touch a dead body, you're impure for a certain amount of time. So if you need to be purified, so that the way you said that implies that eventually, after some period of time specified in one of the writings, that you become, it like goes away without the mikvah.
No, you really need to go through.
Don't become pure until you have the mikvah.
Yeah, you need to go through a purification ritual, and most Jews who really care about these things will do that intentionally. I mean, the whole field of purity impurity is really fascinating because it really has to do with crossing the boundary between the ordinary and the spiritual. You're required to care for a dead body. It's a mitzvah to care for the dead, right? But it also makes you impure because you've touched something that's crossed over to the other plane, to the supernatural world. So sometimes you make yourself unclean on purpose. When the high priest does the atonement ritual on Yom Kippur to atone for all the people, he goes to the mikveh before and purifies himself. And then after he's done all the sacrifices, he has to then go to the mikveh again and purify himself again because he's ascended to a spiritual plane and then come back down. And so by crossing that boundary, he has acquired this sort of impurity by crossing that boundary. So again, it's a fascinating field when you look at psychology, when you look at history. But if you're trying to enforce this regime on people today, it can be really problematic. Yes, Susie.
I have a question. Are there special men attendants for the men who go to the mikvah? Because I know there's women attendants for the women. And do they have a changing of the guard or something?
Well, they usually do it by day. So, like men might go Monday, Wednesdays, women go Tuesday, Thursday, that kind of thing. So you know which day it is when you're going to the mikvah. You can't intentionally mess up on which day you show up just in case. No, there's a whole regime involved in it. But a world of purity and impurity, especially when women become impure automatically, is tricky. And you could even see it sometimes in the rules of how how long a woman is impure after giving birth. She's impure for twice as long after giving birth to a girl as she is after giving birth to a boy.
Mhm.
Regardless of the circumstances of the birth. Obviously, you didn't have C-sections back then because that would kill you. But the ideology of gender is unfortunately often played out on these purity-impurity rules, and often to the detriment of women. It's one of the reasons why some communities won't let women touch a Torah scroll, because she might be impure, or some people are what's called shomer negia. They won't touch a woman to shake a hand or hug or anything that they're not related to, because there's a chance she could be impure. Also, there could be a chance of temptation. That's why women have to walk behind men, because if men walk behind women, they'll be tempted to sin. And of course, what the women think about the men when they're walking behind them, who knows? But that's, again, not the core attention of the male rabbis writing the laws. And speaking of rabbis, our last word on this column is rabbi. Hopefully you understand it. And as I alluded to earlier, the traditional rabbi was not simply a sermonizer, pastoral counselor, community organizer. The rabbi was, in fact, a legal authority enacting Jewish law rulings for his community. Okay, well, we're at 8:30 and we've still got 20 words left to go. So rather than go through every single one, maybe you can take a look through the list and pick out something that you don't know or that you want to know more about, and we can dive into that a little bit.
Can we please go through every single one, even if it's really quickly? So the
What is
bar
Mag-
mitzvah.
The second half.
Magen David? I'm not sure exactly what that means.
Okay.
Jewish
No,
star.
not Mogen David, Magen David.
Yeah, Mogen David's the wine.
You're right.
Named after the
that I
Magen.
know.
Yes. Okay, well, we'll just go through them then. So bar bat mitzvah is originally a legal concept. The idea that at a certain age, you're responsible for all of the commandments. So traditionally, it was thought that there were 613 commandments included in the Torah in its revelation at Sinai. Now, one of the problems with that number is that no one agrees on what that number all is. So maybe they pick the number and then they're coming up with a list later. The second problem with 613 commandments is that no one can perform all 613, because some of them apply to priests and some of them apply to non-priests. Some of them apply to men. Some of them apply to women. Some of them apply to kings. So you'd have to be some kind of weird hybrid farmer, king, priest, man, woman. Like you'd have to be all these to do all 613. You'd have to be an impossible combination. But the idea that at a certain age you have to follow the laws, we understand, right? At age 18, you're subject to the draft. You can be tried as an adult. We have all these legal categories. At a certain age, you require that. Well, in Jewish law, the concept was that for girls at age 12 and boys at age 13, they became a bar mitzvah, or son of the commandment, for boys, or a bat mitzvah, a daughter of the commandment, for girls, and that meant they had to follow all the commandments. So even when you're a kid, you have to follow the negative commandments of, don't eat forbidden food and don't worship idols. But once you get to be older and you're an adult, now you can do the positive commandments too, like honor your parents and recite prayers at a certain time and place. But there was a split. Men were obligated to some things that women were not. And so that let men read from a Torah scroll in a synagogue where women didn't. There's a whole field to explore there. Now, the legal concept of bar bat mitzvah, that dates back 2,000 years. The idea of a ceremony to mark that time when the boy originally and then ultimately the girl in the 20th century became responsible for these commandments, that's a later innovation. The idea of a boy's bar mitzvah started in Germany probably around 1300 or so, end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. And the idea was that this is the first time he's fully commanded to read from a Torah or to study Jewish law or to put on tefillin, the prayer boxes that are strapped onto the arms and the forehead. So it became a special moment the first time he's obligated to do that. And that was the celebration of the bar mitzvah. Sephardic Jews, by the way, Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East, they had the concept of bar mitzvah, but because they let minors do these things even earlier, it wasn't a big deal when they were allowed to do it for real. Where in Ashkenazi Jews, they told them in Europe, you're not allowed to do it when you're a kid. This is the first time you get to do it, so now it becomes a big deal. So the bar mitzvah really is a relatively recent invention in Jewish history, and the bat mitzvah, as a legal concept, is old, but as a public ceremony is even more recent. Not till the second half of the 20th century did it become broadly observed in liberal Jewish circles, where girls get to do a similar ceremony to the boys, including reading from a Torah scroll or from other Hebrew scripture. So that's the background to the bar mitzvah. Was a legal concept first, and then later a ceremony. The next one down is bris. Bris is, again, a Yiddish pronunciation. Remember, like talit became talis. Bris is the Yiddish pronunciation of brit. Brit means covenant. And the original brit that is thought of when you think of a bris is the covenant of circumcision. Now, the Torah describes a couple of other covenants too. There's a covenant where Abraham has to cut animals in half and sees this flaming sword fly between the animals that he's cut in half. I mean, we could still be doing that instead. Fortunately, we're not. But we do still have in Jewish life the Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision, or for short, the bris. Now, in many Jewish communities, especially in humanistic Judaism, the idea of circumcising might be a hospital procedure. It might not be something that's done in a ritual fashion, or it might not even be done. Some families choose not to circumcise their kid, especially if they don't believe in a covenant. Then they might not decide to do that surgical procedure. And a number of communities or families choose instead to do a baby naming. Now, it was traditional on the 8th day when you did the circumcision. It was traditionally on the 8th day. You would also confer a name on the child. You wouldn't give them a name necessarily the first 7 days. Remember, pre-modern times, a lot of babies died, so they wait to make sure the baby makes it a week. Then they're willing to do the circumcision. It's strong enough to handle it and to give it a name. And Jewish girls would have their names announced usually around the 30th day after they were born. So the idea of naming the baby as a way to welcome the child has become very popular. And so you'll have baby naming ceremonies, whether or not it's connected to any kind of surgery on the child. That's the background to bris. Now, a chuppah, again, that needs a chuppah to it. Chuppah is the wedding canopy that you might see at Jewish weddings. Originally, it symbolized the chance of rain, because weddings were done outside, and you didn't want the bride and groom to get wet. But nowadays you'll hear things. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm joking that it symbolized the chance of rain, but it had a practical purpose to it. It wasn't just symbolic of the home they were building together or the wings of the angels covering them. And by the way, the idea of getting married under a canopy isn't unique to Jews either. If you've ever seen Hindu weddings, they often have a canopy called a mandap that's over the couple. And the way they used to do it in India, I understand, is they actually, these were arranged marriages in villages. So they would string the poles, string the canopy between the two houses of the two families that were having the marriage together, sort of uniting them in one. And I have heard Jewish traditions that when your child is born, you plant a tree. And then when they get married, you take wood from that tree to make the chuppah that they get married under. I like that idea. That's a very nice tradition. But yes, the chuppah originally had a practical purpose of the chance of rain, and later on, acquires these kind of symbolic purposes. But also, you can think of it sort of mystically as defining a unique space for the couple as they're getting married. The next one down is ketubah. Ketubah is from the word katav, to write. A ketubah is a Jewish marriage agreement. Now, the ketubah is not mentioned in the Torah, but what is mentioned in the Torah is divorce. It says in one of the legal passages that if a man finds something unpleasant in his wife and writes her a bill of divorcement, a sefer keritut, a book of cutting off, literally, he gets rid of her by writing a document, and then she goes off and marries someone else, and then he divorces her too, she's not allowed to go back and marry husband number one. Now, what that law implies is that you're allowed to divorce him, or at least the man is allowed to divorce the woman if he finds something he doesn't like. Now, in a world like that, women are really up the creek because they don't necessarily own property separate from their husbands. In fact, if they own property and their husband marries them, it becomes their husband's property. It's the whole idea of a dowry, right? It's the property the bride brings into it. So the ketubah was developed as the prenuptial agreement that clarifies what the bride could get in case of a divorce or if the husband died from the husband's estate before it went to his kids. So it was a kind of safety net for women. It was about property and assets and values and how she would be treated in the marriage. The traditional ketubah does not have the word love anywhere in it.
Is it
There's no-
similar to a prenup?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really similar to a prenup, exactly. It's sort of clarifying what property she brings into this partnership, the fact that the husband will add to it, so that that's what she's entitled to in case of a divorce, or if he dies or disappears or whatever, she can claim that ketubah value from his estate. So it's a safety net for women. But what happened in the Middle Ages is they began to become beautiful, decorated texts for people that had money and could pay an artist. They became a work of art. And so what happened in the 20th century was you had this tradition of writing a text, but maybe you wanted to write a different version of a text. So first, the Reform movement writes a different version. And then the Conservative movement adds a clause that says, if the husband refuses to divorce her, the divorce can be decreed by the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism. And so now women don't get stuck as they used to get stuck when the husband would refuse to divorce her. And then people like the idea of writing their own text or writing a text that works for interfaith families or same-sex couples that are getting married. So now you get all these varieties of texts and enter the internet, and you get a gazillion designs that you can choose from. So if you go shopping for ketubahs, you can go to ketubah.com or ketubah.com or eketubahs.com, and you'll find lots of text to choose from and lots of designs to choose from. And you can also write your own and pick it and translate it into whatever language you want. And you can have your own ketubah. It's a much more flexible work of art today than it was a legal document originally. The next word is shiva. You ever been to a shiva? Yeah. So a shiva is the sort of sitting in the home period that people go through after someone has died. But how long is a shiva supposed to be?
I thought it
7
was
days?
actually 7 days.
Right. 7 days. Because,
Or
what'd you say, Jenna?
just isn't Shiva means 7?
Right. Sheva is the number 7 in Hebrew. So the Shiva was the 7 days after the person died that you're supposed to stay in the home and not go out. If you're going to do a prayer that requires a minyan, a group of 10 men, you would have the minyan come to your home, and people will bring you food and so on. What I find interesting is the word Shiva took on a life of its own. So sometimes people do Shiva for 1 day or Shiva for 2 days because they don't feel the need to sit for 7 days. And they do Shiva in their own ways. There's all kinds of rules about sitting on low chairs and covering mirrors and not shaving and not washing. And people pick and choose what they want to do out of the traditional Shiva and how long they want to do it. So I always get a little laugh when someone says, we're doing Shiva for 2 days. Because in my brain I hear, we're doing the 7 for 2 days. Because that's what they chose to do. Susie?
I thought that there were certain conditions and events that end Shiva before 7 days, like Sabbath, Shabbat, and Shiva. So how do you do 7 days if the person is interred on Thursday or Friday?
I think you resume after Shabbat. You like pause it for Shabbat and then you would pick it up. I think the Shabbat counts as one of the 7, but you don't have to do all the rituals during that period.
Can you take a
But also
shower?
other holidays might supersede it as well. If you have Rosh Hashanah coming, that might just terminate it, even if you only got 3 days.
Can you take a shower on Shabbat, even though it's in the middle of Shiva?
No, I think, but you might be allowed to take a shower in preparation for Shabbat because you're supposed to be, clean and dressed up and presentable. And so there is a whole field called halakha of Jewish law that gets into all these subtleties of when can I do this and what can I do this? And guess who you go to ask, am I allowed to do this? The rabbi.
The rabbi, or the priest, if you were back far enough.
Yeah, right. But a lot of these are rabbinic concepts that they've extracted from the traditional laws. They're not always appearing in the Torah literally written.
I never realized Shiva was supposed to resume after the terminating event.
I think it might. Maybe I'm wrong, but as I think about it, if you didn't resume it, you could never hit Shiva because you're always going to run into Shabbat.
That's why I asked the question.
The
Thanks.
maximum you could do is 6. So I'm pretty sure it resumes. Okay, next one down. Mazel tov, right? Means congratulations. Literally, it means mazal, luck, tov, good. So good luck or a good sign. Siman tov, mazel tov is a good sign and good luck. The next one, l'chaim, to life. Another toast when you're drinking. Magen David. So again, the wine is Mogen David, which is the Yiddish pronunciation, but Magen means shield. Magen is a shield, and David is David. So the shield of David is also known as the Star of David. The 2 triangles, right? One triangle this way, one triangle that way. Get a Jewish star. That's the Magen David, is the Star of David. You can see it on the Israeli flag. You can see it in a lot of Jewish iconography. It wasn't always a Jewish symbol. If you go back to ancient synagogues 2,000 years ago, you don't see any Jewish stars there because that wasn't a symbol at that time. It's something that was picked up as a Jewish symbol in the Middle Ages. And sometimes you'll see it in other kind of iconography just as a geometric pattern because it wasn't uniquely identified with Jews until a more recent period. Then we have Sephardi/Mizrahi. You've probably heard of Ashkenazi, which is that group, that name to the right for the Eastern European Jews speaking Yiddish. The Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews are other ethnic subgroups of the Jewish people. Sephardic Jews claim to have roots in Sefarad in Spain, or in communities that left medieval Spain and moved to other parts of the world. There was a Sephardic community in Amsterdam that Baruch Spinoza belonged to. There were Sephardic Jews in Greece, in Salonika, or Thessaloniki as it's called now. There were Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire, all the way along North Africa, and in Italy and other communities in Southern Europe, including in Southern France. Even in England, there were some Sephardic Jews that were hiding out as sort of crypto or secret Jews. So Spanish root Jews are the Sephardic Jews. Mizrahi Jews comes from the word for Mizrah, or east. So they are the Eastern Jews, or we might call them the Near Eastern Jews, the Middle Eastern Jews. These are Jews generally from North Africa or from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Central Asia. Those would generally be called Mizrahi or Eastern Jews. We used to call them Oriental Jews, but Oriental is not really a word that's in favor these days. So Eastern Jews or just Mizrahi Jews makes a lot of sense. Believe it or not, the majority of Jews in Israel are not Ashkenazi Jews. They are Mizrahi Jews. They are Jews from Iraq, from Syria, from Egypt, and Morocco also sent quite a large number of Jews. Okay, the last word on that 4th column is Yartzeit. Any guess what language that is?
Hebrew.
Nope.
That's German.
It sounds German. It's Yiddish for Jewish
Yiddish.
life, right? Yar is a year. Zeit is time. So a Yartzeit is the year time or the year anniversary, and it's generally used to refer to a death anniversary. In Jewish life, you historically didn't track birthdays. That wasn't thought to be a big deal. Yeah, you were born around Hanukkah, you were born before Passover, that general time. But the death date was marked. And so the Yartzeit, the idea of lighting a candle, of reciting Kaddish, of having a ritual around the year anniversary of a death, that was something that was marked as important. So Yartzeit is the word for that death anniversary. Often counted on the Jewish calendar, although I know plenty of people that count their Yartzeits on the general calendar because that's the calendar they use. And they don't have to look it up. They know their dad died on September 14th. They know that date. They don't know what date it is in the Jewish calendar. In my case, I know what date my father died because he died the day before Rosh Hashanah. As a rabbi, that was that was on my mind. So I'm always going to keep track of that date. Okay, so the only concept I really included here is Zionism. This is a very loaded term these days. What does it mean to be a Zionist? Is it a dirty word or not? Zionism, at its essence, was the concept that the Jewish people should have their own nation state like other peoples. It was not there were different like styles of Zionism. There was labor Zionism focused on a sort of socialist vision. There was religious Zionism that had a kind of messianic vision to the project. There were maximalist Zionists who wanted to conquer as much territory as possible. There were Zionists willing to compromise and accept partition plans and other middle ground rather than the greater Israel vision. And even today, there are liberal Zionists and right-wing Zionists that have very different perspectives on what the state is about, how it should be run, what a Jewish state means. Does that mean Jewish by religion, run by the rabbis? Does that mean Jewish by nationality, that it's just ethnically Jewish? Does it mean Jewish by cultural preference? So it's prioritizing the Jewish people over other people who are citizens? Or is it Jewish by historical context and land, but it's a state for all of its citizens equally, including its Arab citizens, which is 20% of the population? So all of those could plausibly claim the title Zionism, and some of them don't recognize the other versions as a plausible version of Zionism. So it's a very loaded term these days, but at its root, it's the idea that the Jewish people can have its own state, as other peoples do. Okay, next we're down on the last column is tzedakah. Tzedakah often means charity, but it's from the root for tzedek, righteousness. The famous prophetic saying, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Actually, it's from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah, it's from the Torah itself, not just from the prophets. But tzedek, righteousness. The idea that charity is not just, your extra money, you drop some coins out of your pocket, but it's the right thing to do. And it's not unique to Jews either. In Islamic practice, there's a tradition they call zakat, which is giving a certain percentage of your assets in life, not just your income. The Catholic tithe is 10% of your income, but the Islamic zakat is 10% of your assets, or a certain percent of your assets. And the zakat in Arabic is the same root as tzedakah in Hebrew. It's the idea that charity is an expression of being righteous, and it's not limited to just monetary gifts. Okay, next word down is Aleph Bet. Sounds like alphabet, right? It's the list of the letters in the Hebrew Aleph Bet or alphabet. Interestingly, they are most likely originally Canaanite letters, because the Phoenicians or the Canaanites, two words for the same people, are the ones who created the alphabet, and the Jews evolved out of the Canaanites. I've got plenty more resources on that history of the evolution of the Jews in our Jewish history class that we teach periodically. But it's fascinating to think that we're still speaking Canaanite, even if the Canaanites are gone, because Hebrew is an evolution of that linguistic tree from Canaanite, and the Canaanites are the ones who came up with the alphabet, which is why the Greek alpha beta follows the same order. In English, we say A, B, C, D. In Hebrew, it's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. Just like in Greek, it is Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. Same sound order as the Canaanite/Hebrew alphabet, or Aleph, Bet. Do I need to tell you what anti-Semitism is? It's a hatred of Jews, but it's actually uses this concept of the Semitic peoples as a kind of racial hatred of Jews, as opposed to being opposed to Judaism as a religion. But once Jews converted, then they were fine. The idea that Jews are inherently Jewish as an ethnic group or a race, to use that term, was the innovation of anti-Semitism, coined in the 1870s by a German anti-Semite named Wilhelm Marr, and continues to plague us to these days. Next word down is Ladino. Ladino, sometimes also called Judesmo, is the Sephardic equivalent of Yiddish. Remember, Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European Jews, spoke that medieval German that translated into Hebrew letters with some other loanwords? Well, Ladino was medieval Spanish, written in Hebrew letters with some other loanwords. And it was the language that Sephardic Jews continued to speak when they moved to Amsterdam and Bordeaux and Salonika and Istanbul and other parts of the Sephardic diaspora. Speaking of diaspora, the next word is that concept of an identity maintained when you're spread out. The word diaspora has two parts to it. Dia is like diagram, spreading out. Spore is like seeds. So a diaspora is a spreading of seeds where you distribute these people, they plant down roots where they are and they grow differently in different soil and different water. And it's a very organic metaphor for the spreading around of Jewish people around the Mediterranean basin and ultimately around the world. It originally applied to a Greek diaspora. You can talk about an Armenian diaspora. You could even talk about a Palestinian diaspora across the Middle East and internationally as well. It simply means a spreading out of people who claim roots somewhere else. So it's not unique to Jews, but when Jews talk about the diaspora, they're referring to the Jewish spreading of the Jewish people all over the world. The opposite of diaspora, to some extent, is the next word, aliyah. Now, aliyah, again, has two meanings, a synagogue meaning and a history meaning. The synagogue meaning of aliyah means you're going up to the bima, to the platform where the Torah reading is taking place. So aliyah literally means going up. But if you're going up in a spiritual sense, in the synagogue to do a Torah reading, you're having an aliyah. If you're moving to Israel, that's also called aliyah, because Israel is thought to be on that higher plane. So if you're moving from the diaspora, from the galut, the exile, in the more pejorative term, you're making aliyah, you're going up to the land of Israel. And you might even make aliyah up to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is up on a higher plateau mountain from the coastal plain where Tel Aviv and Haifa and those cities would be. So actually, when you land in the Tel Aviv airport or the Ben Gurion airport, and you make your way to Jerusalem, you are literally going up into Jerusalem. It really feels like you are making this aliyah, this ascent into this higher space. We talked about Ashkenazi before, the Jews of Eastern Europe. Kabbalah is a field of Jewish mysticism long before Madonna got into it. It was a practice of medieval Jews trying to tease out the secret meanings of the Torah text or the secrets of how the universe came to be, trying to recover the sacred sparks that were scattered throughout the world through mystical recitations and practices. It very much is a kind of magical thinking approach to Jewish life. And it's thought to be limited to certain people to study. Traditionally, to study Kabbalah, you had to be male, you had to be married, and you had to be over 40 years old, because you needed to have your roots on the ground before you explored the mystical truths of the universe. And the last word I have here is Hasidic. Now, people sometimes use the word Hasidic when they mean ultra-Orthodox. And technically, they're not the same. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews who are not Hasidic, but just about all Hasidim, all the Hasidic Jews, are ultra-Orthodox. So one is the broader category of following halakha, following Jewish law strictly. The more narrow category is a particular style of ultra-Orthodox practice that focuses on one Rebbe or spiritual figure who's the predominant teacher, and a little bit more mystically inclined contemplation and more sort of ecstatic, pietistic ritual practices, dancing and jumping. And if you think about the wedding dance and Fiddler on the Roof, that is not something Sephardic Jews did. That is not something that the ultra-Orthodox non-Hasidic Jews did. That's a Hasidic dance. And
when you say a Rebbe, do you mean one specific Rebbe? Or are you saying
yes,
a type of Rebbe?
No, the Rebbe is like the head of the sect. So you have the Lubavitcher Rebbe, originally from the time of Lubavitch, but now leading this group that follows his lead and then his dynasty's lead, the people he anoints sort of as his successors. You've got the Bratslaver Hasidim who follow the rabbi of Bratslav, and you even have the Bostoner Hasidim, which were started from a rabbi in Boston.
There's multiple Rebbes leading multiple sects of Hasidim.
Exactly, and sometimes they hate each other, and sometimes they cooperate on certain things. And sometimes they write the nastiest things about the other Hasidic sects because they're so close, they have to differentiate themselves from each other. But all of them look down on the outside world of treif Jews who are breaking all the rules because they're doing it the right way. They're following the old tradition, which they claim goes all the way back to Moses on Sinai. If you asked an ultra-Orthodox Jew to draw a picture of Moses, he would look like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Long white
Uh-huh.
beard, black hat, black, because the concept is the way it is now is the way we've always done it. It's a fundamentally ahistorical vision of Jewish life. And our approach, coming from a more secular view, is that all of this stuff evolves over time, responds to new circumstances, learns from the surrounding environment, and is creative in new ways. And so that justifies the fact that we're doing the same thing in our own day. All right, well, that's a quick tour through 50 Jewish words. Believe it or not, I've got another 50 Jewish words for our next session, but those are focused on holidays. So we'll talk more about Shabbat, about the high holidays, different symbols you might see, what a menorah is, and how you celebrate Purim in different periods of time, what Tisha B'Av is all about. You might have heard the name, but not really know where it comes from. So that's our next Jewish literacy project. We'll be turning to Jewish holidays and getting a better sense of where those come from and how they can be celebrated.
Can I get a quick clarification on just one of these?
Sure.
So Lawrence said yarmulke in response to what's a kippah, and you were like, well, kind of. So what's the difference between a kippah and a yarmulke?
One is Hebrew and one is Yiddish.
Oh, okay. All right. Easy. That's what I figured, but I wasn't totally sure.
Yep.
Thanks.
Same concept, just different language for it. But I was joking because for someone who wouldn't know what it is, translating kippah by yarmulke, doesn't clarify. It adds information, but didn't clarify what it was.